small things, then what else is he lying about?
Welcome to Secrets of a Murder Detective.
The murder of Mohammed Yusuf in Accrington in September 2016 was one of Lancashire's most callous cases. I'm meeting with a senior investigating officer to understand what really happened, the pressures, the setbacks, and the methods they used to eventually bring the killers to justice.
My name is Paul Withers. I worked for the Lancashire Constabulary, where I retired in 2019 as a detective superintendent. I think the best way to describe this horrendous crime was a cold-hearted and brutal murder of an elderly, vulnerable man. It's a case that will live with me for some time.
Paul, thanks very much for
Hello,
coming
Steve. Nice to meet you.
Much appreciated. Paul, the case we're talking about today stems from September in 2016. What were you doing back then? What was your role?
I was the senior investigating officer, covering the major investigation team and working predominantly in East Lancashire.
Emergency reach service.
So you were made aware of an incident. What were you told at the time?
I received a call to advise me a body had been found in a flat on Granville Road in Accrington. The male who had died had sustained significant head injuries. We subsequently found out this gentleman was called Mohammed Yusuf. A gentleman who was 65 years of age at the time of his death, and he had been found by his landlord that morning. I immediately made my way across to the scene. The scene was secured, and we began to conduct very basic police inquiries such as house-to-house, CCTV inquiries, created a victim profile, and began to work out what were the last known movements of the deceased Mr. Yusuf prior to his death.
As a senior detective, you get so many benefits, don't you, from going to the scene of a crime?
I think, you know, it's imperative that a senior investigating officer attends the scene of any crime. So when I went into this ground floor flat, you know, you start picking up certain bits of information, and I think that helps you then, you know, form the ideas for your subsequent course of action, which way you want to go with the inquiry. The flat was relatively tidy, and the body of Mr. Yusuf was lying in a double bed. He had clearly sustained catastrophic injuries to his head. There were extensive blood patterning on the walls of the bedroom and also sadly up on the ceiling.
There are over 30 different types of bloodstains patterns out there in terms of blood pattern analysis. And you can give really key information to an SIO of the mechanism of how that bloodstain has got on there. My name's Paul Langton, and I was a police forensic specialist working within the Lancashire Constabulary Scientific Support Unit. I specialise in the examination and the interpretation of body fluids. So that could be blood, semen, saliva. But when talking about blood, it's also about blood patterns and the blood pattern analysis.
The ferocity of the attack on Mr. Yusuf really jumped out at me. The extent of his head injuries were considerable, quite a frenzied attack.
This left quite extensive blood staining on the pillow, and in this particular case, there was a distinctive blood pattern which was about 10 foot in the air on the actual wall of the bedroom. And this was described as what we class as a cast-off blood stain, which is a type of blood pattern analysis. And a cast-off blood stain is deposited when wet blood leaves an object, such as like a knife, for example, and it's kind of like a fishing rod kind of momentum, and the blood is left, and it creates a very distinctive lineal mark.
So as the offender was striking Mr. Yusuf and the weapon was coming back over his head, the blood would be distributed across the bedroom.
This sheer level of violence suggests to me that there was a clear intention to end the victim's life. My name is Dr. Shaham Das. I'm a consultant forensic psychiatrist. This wasn't about an assault or trying to threaten or scare the individual.
So as you're looking around the room, sometimes there will be clues as to some things might have happened. So for instance, has there been a break-in? Are there drawers open, clothes strewn around?
Yeah.
Was there any indication there that there had been a break-in?
There's no indication of any break-in whatsoever, Steve. When the landlord went round to the premises, the door was shut, but it was insecure, so it wasn't locked. There wasn't any sign of forced entry whatsoever. I began to consider different scenarios and hypotheses of what could be the reason, the motive behind such a brutal murder. And if I'm honest, I think initially it was quite a concern because there was nothing jumping out, and you know, we needed to be very thorough and meticulous in the way we approached the investigation.
There's a saying in murder investigation, to understand how a person died, you have to understand how they lived. It's about building up the best picture you can of a victim's life to see if there is anything within it or any person within it that would give an indication of why they might have been murdered. What picture were you building up of Mr. Yusuf?
We know that Mr. Yusuf was originally born in Pakistan. At some point he came to live in the UK. He lived at an address on Craven Street in Accrington with his wife and 3 children. We know that sadly his first wife passed away. We know that Mr. Yusuf suffered a degree of ill health. He was quite small in stature in the sense that he was only 5 foot 2 inches tall and weighed 8 stone. We know that he was very well respected in Accrington, and he was described as quite a shy and timid gentleman who simply got on with life and was very friendly to everybody he met. There was no suggestion whatsoever that he'd had any fallouts with anybody. There was no suggestion he was involved in any type of criminal activity. And it's quite a nervy period when you first pick up an inquiry. You know, you have to trust your methods, your processes, the people that you work with, and hopefully as time progresses, that will open up additional lines of inquiry and you start to build that bigger picture of what has taken place in Mr. Yusuf's life over the preceding weeks and months.
During a murder investigation, investigators will get an awful lot of information, and sometimes it can be quite overwhelming trying to understand how it all fits in together. A way to achieve that is by using a timeline. It's a fantastic tool for investigators and sometimes can be the way in which a case is solved.
During the morning of Wednesday, the 21st of September 2016, we know that the landlord of the premises visited the flat at Granville Road at the request of Ruxana Bibi, who was the wife of the deceased. A lot of the initial information around Mr. Yusuf and the residents of the flat came from the landlord when he was interviewed. He told us that Mr. Yusuf and Ruxana Bibi had recently taken on the tenancy. They were living at the address with the adult children of Mr. Yusuf, who both had some minor learning difficulties, but also the 2 younger children of Ruxana Bibi. It was interesting, you know, some of the initial important snippets of information about what had been going on, the fact that Mr. Yusuf had been in Pakistan for 2 months and had only arrived back at the flat on Saturday the 17th of September. So it's building that picture. What has been going on in that household? Who's been living there?
Mr. Yusuf had only just recently got married.
That's correct.
Where was she at the time of Mr. Yusuf's death?
Yeah, so at the time Mohammed Yusuf was murdered, Ruxana Bibi was in Southern Ireland with the 2 children of Mohammed Yusuf. Mr. Yusuf came back to the flat on Saturday the 17th of September. We know that Ruxana Bibi was speaking to the landlord the following Tuesday and was asking the landlord to go and see if she could make contact with her husband. The landlord went to the premises, knocked on but could get no reply, so came away. He spoke to Ruxana Bibi to let him know he couldn't get any answer.
She's got concerns about her husband. because she can't raise him.
Yeah, that's
and she
correct.
knows that he came home from Pakistan on the Saturday.
She does.
And by the Tuesday, she's getting really concerned
Yeah,
about where he is and presumably for his safety.
that's correct. She asked the landlord to go back to the flat, which he agreed to do, albeit he said he couldn't do it till the following day on the Wednesday. So the landlord goes in, and it is the landlord that finds Mr. Yusuf dead in his bed with these significant head injuries. The first 12 hours were very challenging. You know, what are we dealing with here? Why is this very peaceful, relatively elderly man being brutally murdered in his home address? And it wasn't clear. It simply wasn't clear.
The use of family liaison officers in murder investigations is really important. First and foremost, they're investigators. What they are doing, they're helping build up a picture of a victim's life. And by doing that, you can often identify who it was that carried out the murder. In the UK, we have specially trained detectives. It's a really difficult role to perform, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, the family liaison officer role, it's not all, you know, tea and sympathy. It's much bigger than that, much more challenging than that, really, because it is important that they, you know, elicit as much information as they can from bereaved family members, which, you know, depending on the case, can be incredibly challenging and exhausting for the officers involved. In this case, we had both uniform colleagues and detectives working as family liaison officers, working together. Quite a complex picture to begin with, because we know Ruxana Bibi was over in Ireland at the time Mr. Yusuf was discovered. They had regular telephone contact with Ruxana Bibi, which they managed to elicit specific information. You know, they'd recently moved into the flat, albeit at that point, Mohammed Yusuf had never ever lived in the flat, because we know that Ruxana Bibi and the 4 children moved into the flat on the day that Mohammed Yusuf flew out to Pakistan. So that was back in July.
And then when she went to Ireland and he came home from Pakistan, he was there on his own.
Yeah, so the first night he stayed in that flat was the Saturday, the 17th. The second night he stayed there was the night he was murdered. During the afternoon of Wednesday, the 21st of September, we began to conduct inquiries with family members of the deceased, and as part of that process, we needed to speak with the 2 children of Ruxana Bibi. Because they were both under 16 years of age, they were picked up by specially trained officers. As we needed to provide some careful support to the children, and during subsequent interviews with them, they began to provide information around who had been living at the flat on Granville Road, and the fact that Mohammed Arif had been residing there with them and Ruxana Bibi. I think it's important to realise that Mohammed Arif was the brother of Ruxana Bibi's first husband, and this certainly wasn't the last time his name would feature as part of our inquiry. It was at this point as well that we became aware that Mohammed Arif had collected Mohammed Yusuf from Manchester Airport on the evening of Saturday the 17th of September, and that information provided by the girls suggested that Mohammed Arif had visited the flat at 1 Granville Road on the evening of Sunday the 18th of September. So, you know, that introduced Mohammed Arif as a potential key and significant witness at that time that we needed to speak to as a matter of urgency.
So another strand of investigation that's hugely important to modern day murder investigations is CCTV.
Yeah.
What was the CCTV inquiry showing you? What information were you getting back?
We did locate a critical CCTV opportunity that was on the front of a public house nearby that covered the end of Granville Road. It was very important that we identified the last time that Mohammed Yusuf was seen alive. We know from speaking to different witnesses that he was seen on Accrington Market during the afternoon of Sunday the 18th of September, and then later on the CCTV that covered the end of Granville Road. He was seen at approximately 2:30 on Sunday afternoon, and that was the last sighting we had of Mr. Yusuf alive.
An important element in any murder investigation is a post-mortem. It's carried out by a forensic pathologist.
It is.
And it has several purposes, but the main one is to establish a cause of death.
Yeah.
What did the post-mortem on Mr. Yusuf show?
It showed that there were a minimum of 12 blunt force trauma injuries to the left side of Mr. Yusuf's skull. They were clearly delivered with significant ferocity because there was significant disruption of the left side of Mr. Yusuf's head. The markings on the skull gave an indication of a circular pattern, which led the Home Office pathologist to suggest that a hammer may have been used to kill him. There was also quite a significant laceration to the left side of his throat. Clearly someone had cut his throat. Interestingly enough, he had no defence injuries whatsoever. There were no injuries to his arms or his hands. So the thoughts of the Home Office pathologist was that he'd been attacked and beaten to death as he lay asleep in his bed.
Killing somebody in their sleep is quite a cowardly act, so that suggests to me that whoever committed this horrible offence was scared of the confrontation. They were scared of that level of violence. So they probably weren't a career criminal.
So what you're describing to me there is quite a horrific attack, really, on a frail, defenceless, elderly gentleman asleep. That is quite some sustained attack, isn't it?
It is, yeah. The ferocity, you know, you don't always see that. That was quite upsetting, quite alarming.
So the attack was brutal. The victim's skull was crushed, his throat was slit. So to me, that suggests one of two possibilities. Either there was a high level of just hatred and vitriol and rage towards the victim, or probably more likely, it seems like there was a finality in making sure that the victim would die as quickly as possible.
So you start to build up a picture of Mohammed Yusuf's life.
Yeah.
Was there anything coming into it that started to indicate potentially why this might have happened?
The information coming into the inquiry had suggested that Mohammed Arif had been sleeping in the same bedroom as Rukhsana Bibi when Mohammed Yusuf was in Pakistan. Clearly that raises some questions. You know, is Mohammed Arif in a relationship with Rukhsana Bibi? We know that Rukhsana Bibi was previously married to a gentleman called Abdul Hafiz. Abdul Hafiz is the brother of Mohammed Arif. We know that in April 2006, Rukhsana and Abdul Hafiz got divorced, and then 2 days later, we know that Rukhsana Bibi married Mohammed Yusuf. So you've got this very complex family tree that you are trying to make sense of, and you know, it was quite a confusing picture during those first 24 hours, working out the different dynamics. You know, information coming through at that time suggested that Mohammed Yusuf had previously lived at an address at 39 Craven Street in Accrington, but that premises had recently been transferred to the ownership of Abdul Hafiz, allegedly for no financial fee involved. So again, you know, you've all this information you have to make sense of and determine whether or not it's relevant.
When you're investigating a murder, one of the most important elements that can lead you to the killer is if you can identify a motive.
Yeah.
So what you've just described to me within there, my detective brain is
Yeah.
whizzing around. First off, when Mr. Yusuf is in Pakistan, the woman he's recently married is sharing a bed with another man.
Yeah.
To me, immediately that's jumping out as,
Absolutely,
as
yeah.
a
Unusual.
potential. Yeah. Property belonging to him has been transferred to another person.
Yeah.
Unusually, because there is no transfer of finance in order to transfer that property.
Yeah.
Again, another line of inquiry that will be opening up to you. So, from very little information as to why this may happen, you've now got a couple of pieces of information that you're going to have to chase down and
Yeah.
could potentially
Yeah.
be the motive for this murder.
Yeah.
Anybody that comes into a murder inquiry,
Yeah.
particularly where their name appears as prominently as Mohammed Arif is, will need to be spoken to. So I'm assuming you would have sent officers to go and speak to Mr. Arif.
He came into Greenbank Police Station where we spoke to him as a witness in relation to his knowledge and friendship with Mohammed Yusuf. We needed to understand what had taken place when he collected Mr. Yusuf on the Saturday night. We needed to understand more about when he visited the flat on the Sunday. So during the course of Mohammed Arif's discussions when he was being interviewed as a witness, I received regular feedback from the officer who was dealing with him at the time. She advised me that she was very unhappy with him. The fact that she felt he was telling lies, that he was often contradicting himself, and she was unhappy with the way he was behaving. She said he was evasive at times and not really giving a full and thorough explanation of his relationship with Ruxana Bibi, but also his relationship with Mohammed Yusuf.
The very fact that a family friend would lie to the police is concerning. It's quite suspicious, because if he's lying about the small things, then what else is he lying about?
We were also expediting some CCTV inquiries from the camera that covers the end of Granville Road and the flat. That showed that Mohammed Arif's vehicle, the red VW Passat, was visiting the scene throughout Sunday the 18th of September. We obviously know from witnesses and the CCTV on that same camera that the last known sighting of Mr. Yusuf alive was during the afternoon of Sunday the 18th of September. From quite a slow kind of whodunit start, the investigation very quickly began to gather some momentum.
In any modern murder investigation, mobile phone evidence is important. What was the evidence from the phones telling you?
It was reasonably simplistic in relation to this inquiry, in the sense that initially we could establish that Mohammed Arif turned off his mobile phone during the early afternoon on the Sunday and only turned it back on the Monday morning. We know when you look at his history of his phone, he very rarely did that, so that was unusual. He obviously thought he was being clever, but it raised a big red flag above his head.
You're now starting to piece this information together and you've got a decision to make, haven't you?
Yeah, yeah.
What was the decision that you made?
I made the decision that he was to be arrested on suspicion of the murder of Mohammed Yusuf.
Most murders are spontaneous events. Something has happened which has generally triggered an emotion which has led to somebody being killed. Sometimes, however, murders are planned. And if a lot of preparation has gone into a murder, it can make investigating a murder more difficult, simply because the killer's already thought about what the police are going to do, and this can present its own problems.
Once someone's arrested for an offence, it opens up a world of opportunity in terms of investigation.
It does.
For instance, searching someone's home address.
Yeah.
Getting them examined for injuries by a doctor. seizing their clothing, seizing their phone. So all new lines of inquiry would have opened up to you but now, wouldn't they?
Very much so, Steve.
Clearly this gave us the powers to seize his vehicle, the VW Passat. This was lifted forensically and taken to forensic storage. It was then forensically examined by specially trained search officers. From this forensic examination of the vehicle, a small smear of blood was located on the driver's seat.
We can find bloodstains which are like size of a pinhead and smaller. All we need is a few blood flakes from inside the fibres of that fabric, and that is enough to obtain a usable DNA profile to compare it to Mohammed Yusuf.
Clearly this was swabbed and expedited for further forensic examination to see who this blood had come from. We also conducted a fingertip search of the car and located 2 receipts. One of these receipts related to a purchase made at Poundland in Accrington on Sunday the 18th of September, and another receipt related to a purchase at Timson's.
We also searched Mohammed Arif's home address, and again, you know, that provided some really relevant information to the inquiry. We found the last will and testament of Mohammed Yusuf that had been put together prior to him going to Pakistan. That had Rukhsana Bibi as the sole beneficiary of Mohammed Yusuf's wealth, but it also had Mohammed Arif as the guardian of Mohammed Yusuf's children in the event of anything happening to him.
We also found a number of bank cards in the name of Mohammed Yusuf, and also a number of documents around money transfers on an international basis to Pakistan. In addition to this, we also found 2 carrier bags in the cellar of the property with in excess of £22,000 in Bank of England notes within the 2 carrier bags.
So there was an absolute wealth of information relating to Mohammed Yusuf that was in the home address of Mohammed Arif. So I was pretty satisfied at that point that we're onto something here. You know, this is a significant line of inquiry.
When blood is submitted to a laboratory, it's going to take some time to come back, isn't it?
It does, yeah. It clearly has to go through a very specific and timely process.
We eventually received the result of the blood that had been recovered from the driver's seat of his VW Passat, and this came back as blood belonging to the deceased Mohammed Yusuf. So this really was a significant turning point in the inquiry, which gave us some concrete evidence that Mohammed Arif had been involved in the murder of Mr. Yusuf.
It was discussed with him in interview, and his explanation was that Mohammed Yusuf has asthma. He coughs a lot, and when I was bringing him back from the airport on the Saturday night, he's obviously coughed, and that's how the blood has ended up on the car. We clearly took that back to the forensic scientist, and who said, absolute rubbish. You know, this is a contact stain. This is not an airborne stain, this is a contact stain. And the most likely prospect is that when Mohammed Arif has been bludgeoning Mohammed Yusuf to death with a hammer, as he's bringing the hammer back to repeatedly strike Mr. Yusuf, the blood is casting off the hammer and going onto his back. He's then left the address, got into his car to make his escape, and he's transferred the blood from the back of his clothing to the seat that he's sitting on. I think another critical piece of evidence was when we searched his vehicle, we recovered 2 receipts.
Subsequent inquiries identified that the receipt from Poundland was used to buy a knife, which is described as about 9 centimetres long and 2 centimetres wide. The receipt from Timson's was for having a Yale key cut, and this is consistent with the type of key used for the door at the flat at Granville Road.
Which is really significant because there was no break-in.
Correct.
Mohammed Yusuf was murdered in his bed whilst asleep.
Yeah.
So someone having a key, letting themselves into the flat, would be consistent with the evidence that was at the scene.
That's correct, Steve, yeah.
Mohammed Arif left a trail of evidence for the police to follow. There were traces of blood in the perpetrator's car, so he'd obviously not cleaned it. There was even a receipt for the knife used. And to me, this suggests that he's a little bit foolish, perhaps a bit naive. He's not somebody that really knows what he's doing.
So this is a real turning point in your investigation.
Very
because
much, yeah. There are still lines of inquiry that you need to tie in, but at this point, you know, you are beginning to think, right, we need to speak to CPS. We need to start having consultation with, you know, what is going to be the appropriate way to deal with Mohammed Arif. And thankfully they agreed that he should be charged with murder.
On the 26th of September, Mohammed Arif was charged with the murder of Mohammed Yusuf, and he was subsequently remanded in custody pending an appearance at the Crown Court.
So, as part of the detention strategy around Mohammed Arif when he was in custody, we're also getting information that he's also been residing at an address on Wood Street in Todmorden, the home address of Roxana Bibi. So because of that, we obtained a warrant for that address because we felt it was extremely important to conduct a search at this address to see potentially he could have been back to that address after committing the murder. Again, during that search, we found a number of significant documents, including a life insurance policy in the name of Mohammed Yusuf that had recently been taken out that summer. The beneficiary was Roxana Bibi. We also found a piece of paper with a number of signatures saying Mohammed Yusuf. From my untrained eye, you know, I looked at those and I would say somebody's practicing his signature. So you're very quickly developing a picture that suggests that Mohammed Yusuf has been murdered for financial gain, and that this is a conspiracy, certainly involving Mohammed Arif, who is the person who we believe has murdered Mohammed Yusuf, but also involving Roxana Bibi.
For two people to come together who have this idea, this intention to murder another person, it's conceivably common in the criminal underworld, but it's very rare with civilians, because if you think about it, it's quite a high-risk approach to even bring this up as an idea, because you could offend, you could even alienate that other person.
Following the search of the home address of Roxana Bibi, I began to consider her status in the inquiry. At this point, because of the evidence that was presenting itself, I declared Roxana Bibi as a suspect in the case and requested that she was also arrested on suspicion of conspiracy to murder. My view was she'd gone across to Ireland to give herself an alibi at the time of the murder. She'd taken Mohammed Yusuf's 2 children with her, 2 grown-up children, and again I felt this was a way of removing them from the address so he would be alone at the premises when he was murdered by Mohammed Arif.
She was arrested at an address in Darwin. She'd returned to the country. And her reply on being cautioned after arrest was, "Have you found something in my house?" Which I thought was quite surreal, really, because yes, we had found something in the house.
Making a decision to arrest the bereaved wife of a murder victim isn't something you take lightly, is it?
No, absolutely. No, I'd given that a lot of consideration. You know, I think at that point the evidence was very clear. So I wouldn't say, Steve, I lost any sleep over it. You know, I wanted her in custody. I wanted to get her an interview and let's find out what she knows.
What did she say in the interview?
She provided a significant number of pre-prepared statements. She did not make any relevant admissions and basically just denied any involvement in the murder of Mohammed Yusuf.
Unlike Mohammed Arif,
Yeah.
there's no direct link for her to the actual crime itself. She's in Ireland at the time.
She is.
So she wasn't part of the murder itself. She didn't lay hands on her husband.
Correct.
But she could well have been part of the conspiracy
Very
in and
much
around.
so, yeah.
But you don't have enough evidence at this stage, I would suggest, to bring her up to the level of Mohammed Arif. Is that fair to say?
I think that's very fair, Steve. I think whilst the prosecution case was building around Roxana Bibi, I think at this stage we're a little bit off, you know, having enough evidence to actually charge her with conspiracy to murder. There were numerous lines of inquiries that needed to be completed. We had inquiries in Pakistan, we had inquiries in Southern Ireland, there were extensive financial inquiries, all of which we felt that Roxana Bibi would have some involvement in, but, you know, it's no good just thinking, you need to prove it.
If investigators have inquiries to do overseas, that can be really complicated and it can be really time-consuming. It's not as simple as an investigator here picking up the phone and taking a statement from someone abroad, or even getting on a plane and flying over there and seeing them. If police seek evidence in a foreign jurisdiction, they have to get authority from that jurisdiction first. You said you need to make inquiries in Ireland,
Yeah.
and you need to make inquiries in Pakistan.
Yeah.
That's quite complicated, isn't it? And it takes some
Yeah,
time.
yeah, it was particularly the Pakistani inquiries. An officer from the National Crime Agency was exceptional, working with the Pakistani authorities. He went and interviewed many different witnesses for us over in Pakistan, and you know, helped us to continue to build this prosecution case.
Roxana Bibi is in custody, and you're aware at this stage you don't have the evidence that would be sufficient to go to the Crown Prosecution Service and get her charged jointly with her husband's murder. So then you have to make a decision to bail from the police station, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Steve, yeah. Roxana Bibi was released on Part 4 bail.
So by bailing her from the police station, that will then give you time to build up a case to see whether or not the evidence does suggest that she was in fact part of the conspiracy to murder her husband. And that's going to take some time, isn't it?
It is, yeah. You know, we couldn't rush this. We needed to be meticulous, needed to be painstaking, and that's what it was. We didn't leave a stone unturned.
So there's a life insurance policy in
Yeah.
existence, the beneficiary of which is going to be Roxana Bibi.
That's correct.
What inquiries did you make around that?
Clearly, we needed to understand, you know, when the application was made, where it was made, what was the process, who was involved in making that process. Now, from the evidence we got, it showed that Mohammed Arif was heavily involved in that process. They initially tried to get Mohammed Yusuf insured for £500,000. The insurance company involved, after some medical records were obtained, refused to insure him for that sum, but they did insure him for Mr Yusuf for, I think it was £244,000 for a 4-year period.
So Roxana Bibi stood to benefit the best part of £250,000 from the death of her husband.
She did, that's correct.
We also looked at the contact between Mohammed Arif and Roxana Bibi, which was extensive. Indeed, a forensic search of the scene at Granville Road. There was a semen stain found in one of the bedrooms that subsequently came back to Mohammed Arif.
We tested the mattress, and the test we look for is a chemical in seminal fluid called acid phosphatase. We then subsequently sent that off for DNA analysis, and we obtained a male DNA profile and a female profile, which was highly significant in this case.
This was the bedroom that the children had told us that Mohammed Arif and Roxana Bibi shared. Again, this supported the fact that they were in a sexual relationship. I think it's important to realise as well that albeit Roxana Bibi had suggested she was worried about Mohammed Yusuf when she was in Ireland and was trying very hard to contact him, When we looked at the itemised billing of her phone, there was no indication whatsoever that she'd been trying to contact Mohammed Yusuf.
They were colluding, they were working together to exploit a very vulnerable, gentle, timid, elderly man for their own financial gain. So we presented our evidence to the Crown Prosecution Service and they made the decision that Roxana Bibi should be charged with conspiracy to murder Mohammed Yusuf. And we were obviously delighted with that result.
Roxana Bibi was rearrested at her home address in Todmorden on the 7th of October 2016 and she was subsequently charged with conspiracy to murder and remanded in custody. The trial of Mohammed Arif and Roxana Bibi started on the 19th of June 2017. It lasted for 5 weeks, during which all the witnesses came and gave evidence, and the prosecution delivered, I thought, a very, very strong prosecution case.
So trials in the UK all follow the same pattern. The prosecution will present their case. The defence will then present their own case, or defences in this instance. After all that, the jury will trundle out into a room where they'll discuss whether or not they believe that the defendants are guilty or not guilty. So after all of that, what were the verdicts that came back on Bibi and Arif?
The jury returned verdicts of guilty of murder and conspiracy to murder. Clearly, that's a big moment for everybody that's been involved in the investigation. More importantly, it's a big moment for bereaved family members. You know, we were all delighted for Mohammed Yusuf's family. Delighted for Mohammed Yusuf. You know, probably the last thing we could do for him as a police force is to make sure that the despicable people who were involved in his death, you know, face the consequences. So, you know, we were all really pleased.
In England and Wales, when someone's convicted of a murder, there's only one sentence they can be passed, and that is of life imprisonment. But in this country, life doesn't mean life usually. Nope. A judge will pass what's known as a minimum sentence, where before they can apply for parole, they will have to serve a certain amount of time. So in this instance, what sentences were passed to Mohammed Arif and Roxana Bibi?
The presiding judge sentenced Mohammed Arif to 32 years in prison, and he gave a 28-year custodial sentence to Roxana Bibi. He was quite scathing in his summing up, described them as greedy, callous, manipulative, and, you know, clearly the murder was for financial gain.
It appears to me that Bibi never actually really had emotional feelings towards Mohammed Yusuf. It seems that it's purely motivated by greed, because they were married for less than 6 months before the killing. So this is a very short period of time. So I think it's very likely that she had this planned all along.
The family of Mohammed Yusuf conducted themselves with great dignity throughout the 5-week trial. There was never any remorse or apologies from Bibi or Arif, and clearly they're now languishing in prison, where they'll have a lot of time to reflect on what they've done to a very vulnerable and defenceless man.
These people manipulated and eventually killed a vulnerable elderly man who trusted them. So clearly they are callous, they're heartless, they lack pity, and they lack basic empathy.
The file and the case that your team put together for the jury to be able to make that decision was clearly a strong one. And it involved a lot of good, old-fashioned detective work.
That's correct.
What I would like to do, on behalf of especially Mohammed Yusuf, who can't say this to you, just say thank you to you and your team for the work you did to get him the justice that he deserved for that terrible end that he had.
When you deal with cases of this nature, it's a privilege It's a privilege to work for Mohammed Yusuf. It's a privilege to work on behalf of that bereaved family. You know, when you eventually get that conviction, there's no feeling like it. It is a very special feeling.
Mohammed Yusuf was a frail man. He was violently attacked while he was asleep. Why? Simply for his money. So the work that Paul and his team did in order to convict those people of his murder was outstanding. So much so that his team were recognised with a national award for the work they did. That work was what led to the justice for Mohammed and his family for this horrific crime.